Hello everybody and welcome back to section 7 of our new criminology course. Today we are going to be talking about the theories of labeling and reintegrative shaming, which are similar yet distinct concepts. Now, labeling theory came out kind of in the early 60s and was very popular for a while. Although we'll talk about how it's not so much popular anymore, but it's based on kind of a wider concept where it's not necessarily acts in themselves that are deviant or not, right? It's society defining deviance to cover certain things that's more important than the actual acts of deviance themselves, right? And in any given society, it's the powerful, those with money and power and resources, that are able to dictate the rules and define what actions become deviant and what actions are not deviant. And thus, people get labeled deviant not necessarily based on the action itself being a deviant action, but because a powerful group has decided to label that person's actions as deviant. And that label is much more likely to be applied to someone from a non-powerful group than it is to be applied to someone from a powerful group. So we're going to talk a lot more about this because this is very, very similar to the foundation of another concept, which we're going to talk about in 2 or 3 more sections. So hopefully you kind of have a good handle on this, and we're going to talk a lot more about this basic idea of the powerful dictating rules, and the less powerful having a disproportionate impact on what becomes known as deviant than the more powerful. Okay. Now, labeling theory also is very, very centered on a few different concepts from sociology. Okay. One of the main things that labeling theory is intertwined with is symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism says that so much of what we do and think and believe, everything from our who we think we are to how we act to how and what we think, can't be seen and understood in a vacuum. It has to be understood as part of an interaction with the society around us. Everything we do, everything we think is based on our interactions with the rest of society and how they react to us, and the feedback we get from this socialization and being in society and interacting with society process, right? Part of that larger theory of symbolic interactionism is the idea of the looking glass self. And what that basically says is that the way we see ourselves is just a reflection of the way society sees us. So it's not necessarily the way we are that creates how society sees us. It's how society sees us that creates how we see ourselves, right? There's also the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if society is out there and they react to me in a certain way, I am going to see myself in the way they see me, the way they treat me, the way they react to me, right? So the way society treats me, the way society reacts to me, becomes my self-perception, and thus I'm going to continue to act that way. Right? So now we apply these concepts to crime. So in short, this whole process of symbolic interactionism and the looking glass self and the self-fulfilling prophecy means that if those around us see us as deviant, we will see ourselves as deviant. And if we see ourselves as deviant, we are going to act like a deviant. Because that is what our self-image tells us we should be acting like. Those are the things that we have learned from society's reactions that we should be doing, right? So, applied to crime, here's how that labeling process works according to labeling theory. In the beginning, there is some primary deviance, and this is the kind of deviance all of us commit. You know, back when you were children, we all struck our siblings. We all refused to go down for a nap at nap time. We all took a toy away from another kid. That happens to everybody, right? But some kids get labeled by some authority figure as a deviant, right? Now, all of a sudden, these agents of formal control, whether it's the principal of a school or a police officer or somebody else with some kind of formal control power, has decided that this primary deviance in this child indicates that this child is a deviant. It's a bad kid, right? And then the rest of society can kind of see that process happening. They hear that label, and they start to see that kid as a bad kid. That kid then starts seeing themselves as a bad kid and as a deviant. They internalize that label, right? Using that process of symbolic interactionism and the looking glass self that we just talked about, the more agents of formal social control and the more that the kind of social group, social people around them treat them as if that label were accurate, the more they internalize that label, the more they start acting as if that label were true and seeing themselves as if that label were true. And when that label is deviant, they start acting as if they are a deviant. And thus, you get that secondary deviance, the further bad acts that most of us don't commit. And that kind of leads to more labeling, more social views that that person is a deviant, and it becomes this kind of reciprocal, ever-building label internalization, more deviance, more labels, more internalization, more deviance, circular process, right? So, this idea was really, really popular in the 60s and 70s, right? It was really popular both in kind of the criminological literature, in different reform programs and movements, and how we can kind of help decrease deviance both in children and in adults. There were lots of different programs that came about in an attempt to kind of reduce the amount of formal and, to a lesser extent, informal labeling that happens. But most of the empirical research, most of the actual science done to try to assess the impact of labels and whether that labeling process can then create further deviance, has shown very, very little support for this theory. Okay? They've done different experiments and studies to try to quantify the amount of labeling somebody receives and then track and see whether they offend more or less than people who didn't receive that type or that amount of labeling. And in almost every case, there's no real measurable difference, right? So, but it continues to be discussed, it continues to be taught, it continues to be believed by many, because there is this kind of pattern of anecdotal evidence that lots of people claim to have, right? You know, oh, my cousin was always a good kid until he made one mistake and then he went to juvie hall, or, you know, he went to jail for a couple months and then all these other things happened to him and now he's a career criminal. There seems to be so much of that anecdotal evidence that it keeps this idea, it keeps this theory alive, despite the fact that there's little to no real good empirical evidence that really stands up for it, right? That really kind of says this process is actually what's going on in order to create deviance and crime and so on and so forth, right? But interestingly, there are three different kinds of interventions that would be suggested by labeling theory that are also suggested and would be the similar policies resulting from other types of theories, right? One of those is diversion. And diversion is just where if somebody gets in trouble, instead of sending them through the formal process where they are likely to be labeled and seen as a deviant by some agent of formal social control, let's divert this out of the official process, the official sanctioning format, and deal with this case, deal with this issue, deal with this primary deviance some other way, right? And that can be, there's tons of different programs that are all kind of under this umbrella of diversion. Everything from therapy programs to rehab programs to self-control training to all kinds of different stuff, right? Other kind of areas or policy proposals supported by labeling theory that are also supported by other theories are things like decriminalization and deinstitutionalization, right? And this decriminalization is where we take certain crimes and either remove them from being crimes at all or completely change the level of crime they are to make them less impactful, right? So decriminalization can be things like, hey, a lot of those status offenses, like running away and truancy and things like that, those are no longer going to be dealt with through the criminal system. Those are now a completely separate issue that are non-criminal that we can deal with, say, family court judges instead of juvenile criminal court judges or something like that, right? Or it's something like, minor in possession of alcohol is no longer an arrestable offense. It's just a ticketable offense, right? So it's either taking something out of the realm of the criminal justice system altogether and still having it be socially frowned upon, and maybe there's some other process that takes place, or lowering the level within the criminal justice system so there's far less labeling, far less punishment going on, right? And then deinstitutionalization is a very similar process whereby the punishments for even higher level things are less about incarceration and more about the punishments are more along the lines of group homes or therapeutic programs or house arrest, but to keep juveniles especially, but even adults, out of the formal institutions, meaning jails, prisons, etc., detention facilities, where they're going to be labeled, where they're going to have both the external social view of them as deviants and criminals, and also might start internalizing that, if I'm in jail, I'm in prison, I'm in juvenile hall, I'm wherever, I must be a bad person in order for me to be here. So if they're going to treat me like a criminal, I'm going to act like a criminal. Instead of doing that, let's put them in some other type of facility, or find some other way to accomplish those goals of punishment that don't involve institutionalizing them in that kind of formal criminal justice, social control kind of institution. All right. That's our section on labeling theory. We'll be right back with another section on a similar but slightly different topic.